My brother and I had matriculated at Georgetown University Law School intending to become lawyers. We didn't have any money, but I did have ability to write, and I promised that I would write stories about successful men, sell them to the magazines, and pay our way through. And my first assignment, fortunately, was with Andrew Carnegie in Pittsburgh. He gave me 3 hours. And when the 3 hours were over, he said, now, this interview is just beginning. Come on out to the house, stay all night, and after dinner we'll take up the interview again. He kept me there 3 days and nights. And believe you me, I was more than flattered. I wondered what it was all about. He kept talking to me about the need for a new philosophy. He said, we've had many philosophies from the days of Socrates and Plato on down to the days of William James and Emerson, but most of them dealt with the moral laws of life. What we need is an economic philosophy for the man of the streets that will enable him to make use of the know-how gained by men like myself over a lifetime of experience. Well, it sounded very nice to me, except for one thing. I didn't know exactly what that word philosophy meant. And finally, at the end of the third day, he said, now look here, I have been talking to you for 3 days about the need for a new philosophy. I'm going to ask you a question about it. If I commission you to become the author of this philosophy, give you letters of introduction to men whose experiences you will need in collaboration with yourself, are you willing to put in 20 years of research, because that's how long it will take, paying your own way as you go along without any subsidy from me, yes or no? Ladies and gentlemen, there have been many times in my life when I have faced difficult problems and difficult decisions, and I don't think I ever faced one more embarrassing than that. Because when Mr. Carnegie put that proposition to me, my hand was down in my pocket, and I was fiddling with the money that I had there just about enough to get back to Washington, and if I had to stay at a hotel instead of Mr. Carnegie's house, I wouldn't have had that much. I didn't even know the meaning of the word philosophy. And here the richest man in the world wanted me to go to work for him for 20 years without pay. Wasn't that a situation for you? I started to tell Mr. Carnegie, I started to do just exactly what you or the most of us people would have done under the same circumstances. And what do you think that was? What would you have done if you would have faced that sort of proposition, going to work for 20 years without any pay for the richest man in the world? Well, yes, that's what I was about to do. But something inside of me wouldn't let me open my mouth until I got a hunch that if Mr. Carnegie had kept me there for 3 days, it must have been for a purpose. That he must have seen something in me that I didn't know was there. Also, that a man with Mr. Carnegie's reputation for picking men certainly didn't pick me to do a job like that unless he knew I had the ability to do it. And whatever this something was, this silent, invisible person that was standing, looking over my shoulder and whispering in my ear, said, go ahead and tell him yes. I said, Mr. Carnegie, I not only will accept the commission, sir, but you may depend upon it that I will complete it. He said, I like the way you ended that sentence up, and I think you'll do it. You have the job. The only contribution Mr. Carnegie ever made to me outside of introducing me where I needed to be introduced was to pay my expenses in the early part of my relationship with him. The first man he sent me to see was Henry Ford. He said, I want you to go up to Detroit, become acquainted with Henry Ford, observe him carefully, because one of these days he's going to dominate the motor industry. And it's going to be second only to the steel industry. This was in 1908, the late fall of 1908, ladies and gentlemen. I went up there and spent 2 days trying to find Ford, and when I did find him, he came out of the rear of a shop where he'd been doing some experimenting with an old pair of overalls on, a plug hat or a derby hat that had been bashed in the crown, the grease all over his hands. I remember he got my shirt sleeves dirty when I shook hands with him. And I sat down for a half hour with Mr. Ford, and about all of his conversation consisted of yes and no, mostly no. And I wondered how a man like Mr. Carnegie could have made a mistake like that. Imagine if Mr. Ford would ever be a leader in anything. Well, I won't tell you the rest of it. That's enough.